Well, good evening, everyone. It is good to see you all this evening. It is good to be back in our series on background history. I know it's been a couple weeks. We had camp, and then we had church eat church, or fellowship meal, whatever you want to call it. I first heard that in Tennessee, church eat church, where you have church, and then you eat, and then you have church. And I was like, oh, it's a church eat church world out there. It just struck me as so funny when I first heard it. But anyway, we've had a couple weeks since we have gone through all this, and so it worked out well, though, because we got to a good kind of, cliffhanger, stopping point period that's kind of wrapped up before we go on to the next period that we're looking at. So we're going to pick up from there. But let's just briefly review what we've done to get to the point we are in the history that's going on in the world, especially like the ancient, or not the ancient Near Eastern world, but the Mediterranean world up to the time that we talked about. So if you remember back several weeks ago, we started this series of different empires, just one after another, that is taking over the area around the Mediterranean, specifically taking over the area around Israel, where God's people are. By the way, as always, if you have questions, you have comments, feel free. This is more of a class environment. So we have these several empires. We have the Assyrian Empire that comes. They take the northern kingdom of Israel captive. You have the Babylonian Empire that replaces them. They take the southern kingdom of Israel captive. Then you have the Persian Empire that takes over a huge portion of land and lasts for quite a long time. And they actually are the ones who allow Israel to go back to the land that they had once. And so they're able to rebuild the temple. They're able to rebuild Jerusalem and all those kinds of things. That's where Ezra and Nehemiah come in. That's also the period where Esther is, the Persian Empire. So a lot of important things happened during the Persian Empire. And incidentally, that's also the time period when the last book of the Bible is written. So you have this period between the Persian Empire and Jesus where no books of the Bible are being written, but you still have a lot of history going on. And so that's where we jumped off, if you remember, after Persia to Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great, starting off in what's technically called Macedon, but really we'd consider just northern Greece. He first unifies Greece and then conquers basically all of the Persian Empire plus, right? He just conquers this huge amount of territory. But the problem is he starts becoming the leader, if you will, of Macedon at a very early age and doesn't get much further than that in terms of his age before he dies. Now, he accomplishes a tremendous amount of conquest in that short time, but he dies only at age 33. And naturally, what happens when you have a ruler who conquers a huge amount of territory but has no heir and he dies young? Well, all of a sudden you have a power struggle, right? And so you have these four generals in particular, well, not four, several generals in particular of Alexander who all begin to get parts of his empire, and they begin vying for control and fighting each other and all these kinds of things. And we'll come back to that a little more in a moment. But if we remember, part of the result of this tremendous conquest by Alexander the Great, I know this is a lot, I know it's a lot of summary, but we're getting to a point, right? A big result of that was that all of a sudden Greek culture and the Greek language began to spread exponentially across a large portion of the Mediterranean world. Greece was already becoming prominent in terms of their culture, the philosophers, the religion that they had comprised, all these different things were becoming influential already. But with the conquest of Alexander the Great and his successors, even though they didn't have a unified empire like Alexander did, that Greek influence still spread. So if you remember, 3 weeks ago, I guess it was, that's what we ended with, was this idea that now, in the aftermath of Alexander the Great, which, by the way, Alexander is predicted in the book of Daniel and many of the things he did, and in the aftermath of all that, you have a very rapid spread in the influence of Greek culture, even in places that until just a few years earlier hadn't really had much interaction with Greece and its people. So now we are going to look a lot more specifically at one of those Greek, successor kingdoms, as they're often called, and its relationship with the people of God as we move into, we're talking about the 200s or 150s BC, so before Christ. So still about a century and a half before Christ, we're going to start talking about a specific event that begins to take place here. Excuse me. But before we get into the details, I want to ask us a question. And I want us to be thinking about this question as we move through this evening. What happens when you try and force your culture on others? I want us to be thinking about this question. Now, notice I tried to be very intentional in how I worded this. I didn't say what happens when you try and force your religion. I didn't say what happens when you try and influence with your culture. I said, what happens when you try and force your culture, whatever aspects that might entail, whether it be language, it could include religion, it could include all sorts of things. What happens when you try and force that on others? I want us to be thinking about that question as we move through this evening. So, hopefully we kind of vaguely remember this map, right? This is a map of kind of the different divisions of territory in the aftermath of Alexander the Great. So we have over here this yellow, this is what we would call the Seleucid Empire. This is kind of Syria as it kind of came to be called, even though that's very generalized, that's still kind of the idea. It was the eastern part. This is where you would also have areas like Persia proper and stuff would be part of the Seleucid Empire. Seleucus was one of the successors of Alexander, so that's his territory. Down here in Egypt, we have what was called the Ptolemaic dynasty, named after Ptolemy, another one of the successors of Alexander. And then you have some other ones over here. You have different ones like Lysimachus and Cassander and different things like that. Those, for our purposes, we're not really going to worry about because they're not close to Israel, right? We're mainly concerned with these two right here, the Seleucid Empire and the Ptolemaic Empire. Why are we concerned about those two? Beth's over here like this, but that's exactly right. Guess what's right in the middle of the Seleucid and the Ptolemaic Empire? Well, it's Israel. It's Palestine. It's that area where the Jews, since Persia let them go back from exile, that's where the Jews once again live. Now, there are still Jews, of course, spread around the world at this point, but a large concentration of Jews still lives in this area, still worships at the temple, still is trying to abide by the law of God to the best of their ability. So, you have this area right here. It's right in the middle of these two powerful groups, these powerful kingdoms. I hate to even call them empires because they weren't quite that big, but these two kingdoms is right in the middle. And if you've ever watched a movie about, let's say, World War I, what do you call that area in between the trenches of the two sides? Anybody know? So you have the German trenches and the British trenches or the French trenches, let's say World War I. What's that area in the middle called? No man's land. Why is it called no man's land? You ever stop and think? Why did it get that name? Okay, if you go out in that area, there's not going to be no man there. Well, why not? Well, because since it's in between the two, because of the nature in particular of the First World War, no one could ever get any ground. And so every time someone tries to cross from one side to the other, they get gunned down, same vice versa. So basically what ends up happening is that's no one's land. No one owns it. No one can conquer it. It's just there in the middle. Well, in a sense, while it wasn't quite as brutal as that in terms of, the population being destroyed, that is kind of politically the situation that Israel found itself in. It was kind of the no man's land between the Seleucids, I almost said Persia, the Seleucids and the Ptolemies, because they kept on fighting over it back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. And eventually you'd have Seleucus take it over, and then eventually you'd have Ptolemy take it over, and back and forth. And finally, it got kind of stabilized to where after a while of being under the Ptolemaic rule, Egypt, in other words, the area that we see down there in the blue, finally the Seleucids got the upper hand, and they managed to take control more permanently of Israel. Again, we're talking now, we've gotten to about 160, 170, somewhere in there. I can't remember exactly the dating when the Seleucids kind of get a firm hold on this area. So what's going to be the result? Well, remember we talked about all these kingdoms, all these successor kingdoms like the Seleucids, the Ptolemies, even though they're now split, they're all different, they still have at least one thing in common. In terms of the governments, they're all still Greek. Which means that in terms of their style of governing, in terms of the official language, in terms of a lot of aspects of their culture, the dominant force is Greek in nature. Now I want us to think just for a moment, let's use Austin as an example. Austin, Texas, that's our capital city, right? If you live in Austin, Texas, and let's say you have a little bit of money, a little bit of influence, maybe you've served on the state senate, maybe you're a successful business person or something in Texas, you're based in Austin, something like that. What do you want to do as it relates to Washington, D.C.? Do you care what happens? If you are an influential person in a state capital like Austin, do you care what happens in Washington, D.C.? You better, right? Why?
Where everything starts out.
That's where everything starts out. That's kind of the epicenter, if you will, the central hub of all the things that are going to impact you, because you have enough say, you have enough influence in your local area that now you're not just thinking about your general area, you're also thinking about the ones that have influence on you. For the average person in Texas, right, do we really care that much about Washington, D.C.? Not really, right? I mean, I know we care about the elections and it affects us and all these kind of things. That's not what I'm trying to say. I'm trying to say in terms of trying to, be getting good with people who are in power in Washington or anything like that. Like, we don't have that kind of influence. We don't have that kind of anything. But if you're kind of in a higher level, even in a local government type sense, like a state capital in our case, you want to kind of have your fingers on the pulse of the governing organization of the whole, because it affects you, and you have that kind of pull. So thinking about that kind of analogy, what happens when a local capital like Jerusalem is now under the control of a Greek kingdom? What are the prominent individuals in Jerusalem, the ones with a little bit of power, a little bit of influence, what are they wanting to do? Well, they're probably going to want to have decent relationships with their Greek overlords, right? And what's the best way to fit in with the people who are over you? Well, historically, we see that a lot of times what happens is you try and start emulating their culture a little bit. You try and start kind of intermingling yourself with their practices, because usually that will give them a better opinion of you. So just like we see in just about every other society, including our own, once the Greeks began to take over, this is both for the Ptolemies when they first took over, and especially the Seleucids when they gained control of the area of Israel, a lot of the prominent Jews in Jerusalem in particular started adopting Greek customs, Greek language, Greek practices, simply because that's what you do, isn't it? If you're in that kind of position, if you're prominent in your localized area, you want to kind of be a go-between between your local area and those in charge. And so you begin kind of assimilating, if you will, into the culture that is dominant in the overall system that you're in, not just the system that's dominant in your local area, because they're not the ones with the power. The Greeks, in this case, are the ones with the power. Now, we said Greek culture can involve a lot of things. And we talked about some aspects of Greek culture a few weeks ago. Some of the things, you have language, or you have different kind of, myths and legends associated with the Greeks, or philosophies, or literature, stuff like that. Some of that, it's give or take, it's whatever. But, of course, you also have things like religious beliefs and practices that are part of Greek culture. Now that, of course, creates a problem, because now we're talking about Jews who are being influenced by Greek culture, naturally there's going to begin to be a pull, as really there had been for centuries in Israel's history, to assimilate not only to the very, harmless aspects of the culture, but also to the religious side of Greek culture. And so that begins to happen. For a while, the priests, the high priests specifically, are able to kind of keep that at bay. So you have the Greeks taking over. For a while, you actually have a lot of the priesthood being pretty faithful in trying to keep that influence, as far as the religious aspect of it, away from the Jewish people. You have the priests encouraging the people to remain faithful to God, to the law. You even have a lot of allowances being given to the people of Israel from places like, the Greek rulers, we want to call them that. They're giving them a lot of allowances to continue their ancient religion. There's not a whole lot of pressure yet. But what happens when you're the high priest in a system like this? Well, now you're one of the people with a lot of influence, with a lot of power, because remember, the Jews don't have a king anymore. So the high priest becomes not just the religious leader, but in the eyes of the Greeks, the priest is also kind of the leader as a whole. He's kind of, in a sense, in their system, kind of the governor as well as the religious leader of the Jews. Well, you have, as we get towards about 150 BC, you have a high priest who is, by all accounts, very faithful to the law and trying to keep the Jews as a whole faithful to that law. His name is Onias III specifically. He is trying to keep the Jews as faithful as possible to the law, even in spite of all of this influence. And it's not any kind of force yet. It's simply influence to conform to Greek practices, to Greek customs. But lo and behold, because the office of the high priest is now becoming more and more political, there are people who want his job. So, as Onias is trying to behave in this way, he's trying to keep the Jews loyal to their practices, guess what the tactic is for someone who wants to usurp his position? Well, he goes, in this case, there's a man named Jason. Jason goes to the Greek official and says, hey, this guy is keeping the Jews in a backward state. He's preventing progress. He's not allowing the Jews to fully be part of your glorious empire that you built. Let me be in charge as high priest instead, and I will help the Jews assimilate and become more civilized. Because that's what the Greeks saw it. The more you conform to Greek culture, the more civilized you are. And so Jason makes this appeal and also offers a bunch of money, and he is made high priest in Onias' place. And eventually you also have someone even succeed him that's even more radical in promoting Greek culture and even Greek religion among the Jews. His name was Menelaus. So you have these two high priests in succession after Onias who begin more and more to create this influence. Again, there's no force yet, but they are continuing to put a little more cultural pressure to make the Jews conform to Greek religions. For example, remember this guy? We had him a couple weeks ago. Remember how the Jews, or rather the Greeks, would conduct their, their workouts? Well, they would erect what is called a gymnasium, and you would work out there in the nude. That was part of the practice. Now, we talked about before, if you are a Jew and you want to go work out in the gymnasium, now granted, by the way, it was divided between men and women. It's not like you have men and women both working out in the same place like we do in gyms today. But if you have a bunch of men in a room working out with absolutely no clothes on, because that is how they did it, well, guess what happens if you're a Jew? Well, you stand out a little bit because you're circumcised if you have been raised according to the tradition of your fathers. And the Greeks are looking at you like, what is wrong with you, you weirdo? And they're teasing you. They're making all these jokes. I'm not going to repeat the jokes, but there were a lot of ridiculing type jokes being directed at the Jewish men. They were being, basically called emasculated and things like that, because of the sign of the covenant that they had, the sign of circumcision. Well, obviously, in that kind of environment, you don't really want a Greek gymnasium to be erected in a place like Jerusalem, because Well, that's going to create even more pressure for people to abandon practices like circumcision and follow the Greek model. But Jason, because he's trying to get in good with the Greeks and has offered money and all this kind of stuff, he decides, you know what, we're going to build a gymnasium in Jerusalem. And so he starts building things like gymnasiums, like different structures that are designed specifically to push the Jews more and more towards Greek culture, the Greek mindset, even subtly toward the Greek religion. You would have, for example, at least potentially, this is a suggestion of how this might have gone, you would even have places where young people would be taught things like philosophy and literature and stuff like that, and those teaching rooms, those schools, whatever you call them, they would begin to introduce ideas like, well, yes, you talk about Yahweh, but really Yahweh is just another name for Zeus, right? You take this kind of syncretistic approach, basically the idea of melding a bunch of religions into one. That was one of the strengths of the Greek religion, right? Is that they can take all these other religions and kind of fold them into theirs. So you have this kind of influence happening under Jason and later under Menelaus, even in the city of Jerusalem, that is supposed to be trying to be faithful to the law of God. But there's still no force being employed yet. This is pressure from a societal perspective, from a cultural perspective, but there's still not force yet. So you still have plenty of Jews who are saying, no, I'm going to be loyal to the law of God. And you also have Jews who are saying, well, if the high priest says it's okay, I guess it's okay, and begin to compromise and go more and more down the path of following not just Greek culture, but Greek religion as a whole. So what happens next? Well, that's where we get to this guy. His name is Antiochus IV Epiphanes. Now, Antiochus Epiphanes, is an interesting case on several levels. For one thing, that moniker at the end, that name at the end, Epiphanes, is supposed to be this idea of like the exalted one or something like that. I think it has even a kind of a divine aspect to it. I don't remember the exact definition. But that was a very, how should we put it, a very flattering title that he liked very much to have applied to himself. A lot of his subjects behind his back called him not Epiphanes, but Epimanes, which basically means madman, because that's kind of what he was. You think about, for example, and we'll talk about this down the road, but have you ever seen depictions of Nero, the emperor who would be the emperor of Rome later on down the line? How he was kind of a madman who had kind of lost it. He drank too much out of those lead pipes or something, right? That's kind of the same image we're given historically of Antiochus IV. He kind of was a little bit missing something in terms of, how shall we say this, being reasonable in dealing with others. Now, we want to go back here to this map, because under Antiochus IV, just as had been going on for a long time, Antiochus doesn't like the Ptolemies down there in Egypt. He wants to expand this big yellow area to be bigger and bigger and bigger, and he thinks the first step of that is going to be to take out the Ptolemies. So he's going to try. They've already conquered areas like Israel, his forefathers have. He's going to try and push even deeper into Egypt. So he begins, as he takes command, as he takes the throne in the Seleucid Empire, he begins to put together an army so he can invade this area of Egypt and take it for himself and hopefully fold it all into his empire and meld the two together to where it's all under his control. So he begins invading down here in the northern area of Egypt, and it's going really well. But there's a problem. Someone comes to meet him as he is continuing to march against Egypt. They come from this little city called Rome. Now, Rome is not an empire yet. They don't even have a colony outside of Italy yet. They don't even have all of Italy yet. But they're already becoming a force to be reckoned with. And even though they can't take over everything yet, they're beginning to strategically make alliances and ultimatums to keep things going according to their interests. And Rome, they got a lot of food from Egypt. And it was not in their interest for there to be a bunch of wars going on over there. So Rome sends a senator. According to legend, they send this senator, and he gets off onto the beach in front of Antiochus IV. He walks up to him, and he basically says, the Senate of Rome demands that you turn around and stop fighting. And Antiochus, of course, is not very happy about that. He says, I'll consider it. And so the senator takes a stick and draws a line in the sand around Antiochus and says, you will give me an answer before you leave this circle. That is already the amount of influence Rome had, even though they did not have an empire yet. Now, Antiochus was strong at this point. He was not strong enough to fight both Egypt and Rome. Rome's legions were already becoming a legendary force. So Antiochus has to go back. He has this massive army. He has all these preparations. He has all these plans for glory. And all of a sudden, unexpectedly, he has to turn back. Well, guess where he's going to have to go back through first as he returns to his homeland? You guessed it. This little area right here, Israel. And he's not happy about his life right now. And he's been hearing all these reports about how these high priests that he has installed, like Jason and Menelaus, have been having pushback from these Jews who just insist on remaining loyal to their backwards ideology, their backwards religion, not accepting a lot of the cultural, what he would consider advancements that Greek philosophy and culture had to offer. And he's already in a bad mood. He's tired of it. So guess what he does? Well, now we have force begin to come into play. He begins to enact very strict laws in Jerusalem and Israel as a whole, demanding that they conform to the practices of Greek culture and of Greek religion. He begins to enforce the idea that if you are circumcised, you can be punished because you are no longer to follow this backwards law. He demands that if you begin to even practice a lot of the general practices in terms of sacrifices, things like that, of this backwards religion, that you will be punished. And he has an army to back him up because that army now has nowhere to go. So the Jews are kind of out of luck. Interestingly enough, once again, this is predicted in the book of Daniel. At the time appointed, they have this long section about the king of the north and the king of the south fighting in the book of Daniel. That's talking about the king of the Seleucids and the king of the Ptolemies. And it says at this time, at the time appointed, he shall return. It's talking about Antiochus IV. He shall return and come into the south. Remember, he's going to invade the south. But it shall not be this time as it was before. Remember, they've been fighting back and forth, but it's not going to be like that this time. For ships of Kittim shall come against him, and he shall be afraid and withdraw. If you're wondering, Kittim refers to an area to the west that is often associated with Rome. So Daniel is predicting all these things that we've just discussed happening. Not only, however, does he come back, does he begin to institute all these laws, he takes it one step further. Antiochus, again, is tired of this religion of the Jews, so he not only makes all these laws to prevent them from worshiping God as they have been wont to do, but he even goes into the temple personally, the temple of God, the place where the Ark of the Covenant is, and he erects a statue to the god Zeus in the temple so that Zeus may be worshipped instead of Yahweh. This is what Daniel refers to as well in Daniel chapter 11. It says, he shall turn back, again, this is talking about Antiochus, he shall turn back and be enraged and take action against the Holy Covenant. He shall turn back and pay attention to those who forsake the Holy Covenant. So if you forsake the law, Antiochus is going to like you. He's going to reward you. If you remain faithful to the law, he's going to take action against you. And notice, forces from him shall appear and profane the temple and fortress, and shall take away the regular burnt offering, and they shall set up the abomination that makes desolate. Now, there's been a whole lot of speculation about that, but when you line everything up historically, he's talking about the statue of Zeus. And not only the statue of Zeus, whenever he erects that statue to Zeus in the temple, he makes a sacrifice to it. Guess what he sacrifices on the altar to Zeus? What animal do you think he sacrifices? He sacrifices a pig. Now, if you remember, according to the Jewish law, a pig is an unclean animal. So this is meant not just to solidify the worship of Zeus, but to insult and desecrate the Jewish temple so that the religion of Yahweh can no longer be practiced in this place. This is the degree to which Antiochus is now willing to force Greek culture, not just pressure the people into conforming to Greek culture, force Greek culture down the throats of the Jewish people. Again, if you get a king who's kind of bordering on a madman, you give him an army and then you don't let him go invade anywhere with it, bad things are going to happen. This is what happens with Antiochus. But all of this is predicted in the book of Daniel, which is very interesting. So all this begins to happen. It begins to be very, very difficult for a Jew to be faithful to God at this time. But something's about to happen. What happens when you try and force your culture on someone else? Let's go ahead and start answering that question. What happens? Some people, right, they conform if they don't really feel like they have any stake or any emotional attachment. But let's say that, I don't know, I almost said Japan. Japan's so westernized. Let's say China or Russia came over here and tried to force us to conform to their culture. There would be some people who would go along with it, but there would be plenty of people who resented it. For sure, you're going to have resentment. But then when you start mixing religion into the mix, you're not just going to have resentment. A lot of times you're going to have full-on rebellion. Notice verse 32. He shall seduce with flattery those who violate the covenant, but the people who know their God shall stand firm and take action. Now, we could read a lot into that phrase, take action. I would argue the basic idea is they are not going to submit. They are going to take action in the sense that they're going to remain faithful, come what may. But that's not the only action that occurs. I want to show you this tiny little city. I'm sure you can't read it. But here you see is Jerusalem right here. This is the capital. There's this little place over here called Modin. Just a small little town by any standard, really, over in the Judean countryside. And as these edicts from Antiochus begin to circulate around Israel, it begins to move not just around the city of Jerusalem, but into the surrounding areas, even into the small towns. So one of Antiochus' officials goes to this little city, Modin. And he insists, as all the other officials are insisting in all these other cities, that the town as a whole make a sacrifice to Zeus. Well, one of the priests, a man named Mattathias who lives there, he refuses. He's not going to do that. But, as always, you can find people who compromise anywhere. Another priest says, yeah, sure, I'll do it. And he moves forward to make this sacrifice. And Mattathias, perhaps channeling Phinehas from earlier in Israelite history, who struck down people who were blatantly sinning before him, Mattathias approaches this priest and kills him at the foot of the altar that he was going to offer the sacrifice to Zeus on. And then he turns around and kills the Seleucid official for good measure. This sparks a little mini revolt in this town as the inhabitants turn on all of these Syrians or Seleucids who are there and attack them. And so now, all of a sudden, there's a bunch of people who have turned themselves into criminals because they would not sacrifice. However, Mattathias, he was an old man, but he had sons. He had 5 sons, to be specific. But one of those sons in particular, Mattathias knew would be capable of turning this from a spark into a flame. And so as these individuals in this tiny little town in Judea have began this revolt, if you will, in this small little area, Mattathias turns to his son, not his oldest son, interestingly enough, his middle son, and says, I know you are capable of making this into something bigger. So I'm going to entrust to you and to lead everyone who will follow us, and we are going to begin to take back our nation from these people who are desecrating the throne of God. His son's name was Judas, but he would one day be given the title Maccabeus, which means hammer. And these events would be the beginning of what is known as the Maccabean Revolt. What is the Maccabean Revolt, you ask? Well, next week will come very soon. But let's think about this. What happens when you try and force your culture on others? Well, as we said, people resent it, and eventually they revolt. I hope we can picture what that would look like in an environment like ours. That's the very real situation that is happening for Jews at this time, about 150 years before Christ. Now think about it as we lead into next week. 150 years. Anybody just off the top of your head know how long ago our country started? It was a little more than 150 years, about, 240 or something like that, I believe. So we're talking even less time, and yet the American Revolution still very much affects our culture. So I want us to think about the parallels so that we can understand what's happening for them as we move into next week. Policies of Antiochus IV and the resulting revolt, which reshape Jewish history for generations. And the reason why we're talking about all these things we've been talking about is because all of these elements of Jewish history are going to have a huge impact, not just on the history of the Jews in general, but on where the Jews are at when the Messiah finally comes. Any comments or questions? I know we went a little over this evening, but any comments or questions before we wrap up? All right, well, I hope this has been helpful. We will get more into what actually happens in this revolt next week. As always, we want to extend the invitation. If there is something we can do to encourage, to pray for, to in any other way help you, please let us know as we stand and as we sing.